Hi there, and welcome to Plant CEO. In today's episode, I'd like to welcome Shannon Falconer, the CEO and co-founder of Because Animals. Hi, Shannon. How are you?
Hi, Anna. I'm great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you on the show today, especially with the recent press that you've had with the fundraising and the launch of your cultured meat product. So super excited to speak to you today.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be here.
So can you start by telling me basically what's wrong with pet food today?
Sure. There are several problems on several different levels. So first of all, I'll start with the problem for pets. So the vast majority of pet food is made with something called 4D meat, or it comes from animals that are dead, diseased, dying, or disabled. In the industry, these are commonly referred to as fallen animals. And these animals are basically the animals that never make it to slaughter. So they die during transit, of dehydration, suffocation. And so if they don't actually make it to slaughter, they can't be sold for human consumption. So these carcasses then are shunted to pet food. Pet food is also made up of that other 50% of the animal that humans don't want to eat. So there's a lot of meat that doesn't actually make it to the human food supply chain. And that then goes to something called a rendering facility. And in fact, in Canada and the US alone, just in terms of numbers, it's 25 million tons of this meat, or this carcasses. So it goes to this rendering facility. By the time when it's there, it's heavily at this point, it's very, very infected with various, lots of microorganisms, pathogens growing on it. So this meat needs to be sterilized. So it's subjected to high heats and pressures in order to actually kill all of the pathogens that are in the meat. And then what comes out is then added into pet food. And so that's okay, as long as, I'm sort of saying that's okay, but I mean, that's okay as long as all of the pathogens are indeed killed, which doesn't always happen, which is why there are recalls on pet food due to bacterial contamination. But the other issue is that some of the carcasses that end up in the rendering facility that cannot be designated for human food consumption, these also, the origin of this meat is not always very clear, which is why we've seen instances of the FDA recalling pet food due to contamination by something called pentobarbital, which is a euthanizing agent. And so food animals are not euthanized with euthanizing agent, as you might imagine, because it's lethal. And so this is not for any animal. No animal that's actually euthanized with this should be consumed. But for some reason, these types of carcasses have ended up in the food supply chain for pets. And so it's a dangerous proposition. It's just in terms of the whole channel from where pet food actually comes from. So there are problems with respect to pet food for our animals. The other problem with pet food, if you think about it from an environmental perspective, there was a study performed not too long ago by a researcher out of UCLA who showed that actually more than a quarter of the environmental effects of the animal agriculture industry in terms of deforestation, water, fossil fuel use, is directly attributed to the foods that Americans feed their cats and dogs. I mean, this is a huge percentage. And it's a percentage of meat or sort of that arena of animal agriculture that nobody's really paying attention to. And so if you think about, how much meat is not consumed by humans, but is instead sold to pet food rather. So this is a very, very lucrative financial outlet for the animal agriculture industry. And basically in the absence, to put a fine point on it, in the absence of being able to sell all of this meat to pet food, the animal agriculture industry as we know it could simply not exist. So if we are motivated as a society to change the status quo in animal agriculture, we have to address pet food.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think more and more people need to know that point, right? Why isn't it being talked about more?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think a lot of people, because perhaps the flip side of it is, and this is certainly what the National Renderers Association, there's actually an association, they would, they market this as a sustainable practice, right? So they use these same statistics that I've used. In fact, that's where I got these statistics from. They use them as a sort of marketing tool to say this is actually very sustainable. And they themselves have said the animal agriculture industry could not exist in the absence of doing this. Therefore, we need to continue to do it. And it's good for everyone.
Yeah, it's like a very vicious circle, isn't it? In a way.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, those facilities, the rendering facilities that are basically sort of creating very high pressure environment, high heat to basically kill all the bacteria, stuff still makes it through into the food, right? That animals eat afterwards. And that's part of the recalls. And then you have these euthanasia drugs that end up there. And what I'm confused about is, where are those drugs coming from? Because wouldn't that be from like horse meat or something like that?
It would be, yeah. And so nobody's actually really, it's remained very unclear as to how euthanasia agent ended up in pet food. There's been no clarity around that whatsoever. But certainly if we think about, okay, what animals are euthanized with pentobarbital, it's horses, it's dogs and cats. So basically pentobarbital made it into those rendering facilities through one of those species.
So pets, cats or dogs could be eating the same species, basically, potentially.
They could be, yeah. I mean, it's something that is, the industry has said, no, this is not the case. This is not the practice. We do not pick up euthanized pets from shelters and bring those carcasses to the rendering facility. They've said that time and again. Horses, however, that's a little more of a gray area. But the fact remains that pentobarbital has gotten in there, and it's not coming from cows or pigs or chickens or fish.
Yeah. So I'm all for having more companies like yourselves getting created in order to basically combat this issue. So what's your solution at the moment?
Right. So for us, because Animals is tackling this by making cultured meat. So cultured meat is not a meat alternative. Cultured meat is meat produced in an alternative way, alternative to raising and slaughtering an animal. So cats and dogs, I will make the argument that even more than humans being omnivores, who certainly can live and do live long, healthy lives, arguably longer and healthier lives without consuming animal products. Cats in particular, in the wild at least, are obligate carnivores. So in the wild, they do need to consume another animal in order to obtain all of those nutrients. I will put the caveat on it that when we're feeding our pets a commercial diet, things are very, very, very different. So we can get all the nutrients that cats need from synthetic sources. They don't have to come from an animal when we're feeding them a commercial diet. And in fact, if people are feeding their pets a commercial diet, the reality is they are actually feeding them all the nutrients they need. Let's call out taurine, because that's the one that people think about most when they think about cats. And being a vegetarian or vegan, they're not getting taurine, because taurine is in the wild only produced by another animal. But in commercial pet food, taurine actually is in pet food. It's a synthetic source of taurine, because the rendering process being so incredibly aggressive. The taurine is lost in that process. So taurine has to be added back in order for that food to be made nutritionally complete. So what I will say is, there is, so cats are carnivores in the wild. And although we can feed them a nutritionally complete diet that does not contain meat, the reality is that people just won't buy it. They don't buy it. Cats are carnivores. Even a lot of people make the argument, still believe very, very ardently that dogs are carnivores and they need meat. So regardless of what the reality is, people want meat for their pets more than they want it for themselves, even because, humans, most people accept that humans are omnivores. But dogs and cats, not the case. So really plant-based products or alternative protein products for pets, really they will be niche-based. They will be a niche market. And they just won't move the needle if we're actually dedicated to replacing those products made with animals in pet food. If we're looking at replacing them with something that's humane and sustainable, yeah, the plant-based is just not going to cut it. So we're making meat, but cultured meat.
What would you say with dogs? I think they are omnivores, that especially ones that are in a home environment. You can thrive dogs as long as they're getting complete proteins because of amino acids. So there was also a dog that lived the longest called Bramble.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if you've heard about that, who is pretty much a plant-based diet dogs. And I know plenty of pet owners who are giving their dogs even things like home cooked rice and lentils, a mixture of lentils, and they're thriving quite well, and no issues with joint pains or their skin. Coat seems to be thriving even better. But I get the point about the culture, and but I do see them endure to some degree, that we need both of these. And I think probably maybe the cell-based approach will be a bigger market long term. And I think a lot of the companies that are creating plant-based dog food will have that as their first products and maybe start investing into the cell-based potentially as well. What are your thoughts around that?
I fully agree. Definitely for dogs, because animals are we're in the process of formulating a plant-based diet for dogs. So I fully agree that both options should be available to consumers, and dogs can absolutely thrive on plant-based diets. My dogs do. That said, we recognize that a lot of folks, they do just want to feed their pets meat. So for those people, that option will be available to them. But you made a comment about how for those pets that are thriving on the plant-based, healthier coats and fewer health issues. So perhaps this, I don't know if you're going to bring it up, but maybe this is a good time to segue into it. One of the reasons why we're focused on culturing mouse for cats rather than sort of chicken or beef or fish is because actually chicken, beef, fish also happen to be the main allergens for our cats and dogs. And the only reason those are actually included in pet food is because, of course, they're left over from the human food supply chain. But in the wild, cats eat mice, they eat small birds, and they eat insects. So in culturing meat, we saw this as a really good opportunity to actually create the protein source that is most evolutionarily appropriate for our pets. So that's where the mouse for cats comes in, and we will work on rabbit for dogs.
Yeah, got it. So it's a good way to reset in a way.
Yeah, it's like
2.0 for cats.
Yeah, that's right.
Getting back to nature.
Right.
So with rabbits then, obviously dogs in the wild will be eating rabbits. Do they eat any other animals in the wild?
Yeah, so cats are less diverged. So cats are less domesticated than dogs. I would say that the domesticated dog is a species of domesticated breeds that would not exist in the wild. So wolves are their most recent common ancestor, but metabolically they look very different from the domesticated dog. So although domesticated dogs do in some parts of the world live in the wild, it's not because they evolved there. It's because we have a problem with people getting pets and not neutering them and humans being irresponsible. It's not that these dogs living in the wild actually evolved in those environments. They didn't. This is just a product of humans being negligent. So there's really no such thing as dogs in the wild. And what do they eat? I mean, for the most part, those poor dogs in the wild, they are just scavenging because they're starving. So they're eating anything, garbage most often. But wolves in the wild, mostly rabbits or even smaller rodents. But dogs metabolically are quite different from wolves.
Yeah. Can you explain how the cell-based process works in terms of your manufacturing?
Yeah. So basically what we do is, or what we've done is, in a one-time scenario, we've taken some cells from an animal. So in this first case, mouse, and then that's it. No more cells come from mouse. So it was only that one-time thing. And so those cells basically form the basis for all the cells that we will ever grow in the future. And so we basically, to grow those cells, it's actually, the process is very similar as how cells would develop inside a body. So we grow those cells inside a vessel, which is warm and allows for gas exchange. So we call it a bioreactor. In an animal, it would be a womb. And then we feed that bioreactor, feed those cells vitamins, minerals, all of the nutrients those cells would obtain from the animal inside the body. They are now obtaining them inside the bioreactor, and they are growing. They are growing just the way they would inside a body. And so as they continue to grow, in the end, we basically harvest that meat and those cells, and then blend them with other ingredients to make, in this case, a cat cookie, and then in the future, nutritionally complete food for dogs and cats.
Yeah, and what percentage of that cultured meat, for example, would end up in your cookie product, and what makes up the rest of the ingredients?
For our first product, which is the cultured mouse cat cookies, so the cultured meat at the moment is lower on the spectrum, and because it is a cookie, right? It's a nice to have for cats. It's not a nutritionally complete food. So that's 10%, roughly 10%. The other ingredients are in there are other ingredients that would already be found in other types of cat cookies. So we include nutritional yeast, which is a really, really nutrient dense source of protein and various vitamins, in particular B vitamins. We've also included some other, some tempeh, so sort of fermented soy, which is tasty and nutritious, miso, pumpkin puree. So yeah, these are ingredients that people are familiar with.
Yeah, I actually I thought 10% was high, because I thought that some of the traditional sort of pet food products only have like a few percent of whichever animal that they're saying on the packaging is. But maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it's according to different countries or something, that in order to say it's this product, they only need to put a really small amount in.
Definitely when it comes to the US and labeling, there are rules around this, and it would have to, if you were to say, this is a chicken food, chicken has to be sort of the first ingredient. So when we actually move towards the nutritionally complete food, that's a different story. Then that will be, in terms of inclusion rate, I mean, that would be the first ingredient. But treats, it can be lower.
Oh, okay. And thinking about the starting culture of how you're, in a way, cultivating the cells, traditionally, other companies, cell-based companies, would be using fetal bovine serum, or FBS, right? Mm-hmm. And which is obviously coming from cows in a not very nice way. And you've created your own culture, which is that plant-based as well?
So the nutrients there come from either plants or microbes. So nothing comes from an animal. So we use no animal ingredients in any media at any point in our growth phase. And that was a really important point for us to nail down early on. And I'd say one of the ways that we were able to do this, I have a PhD in biochemistry, and so and my area of interest in particular is sort of basically looking at the mechanism of how molecules work inside of cells. And so basically, we were able to say, okay, this is what this growth factor that comes from an animal does mechanistically. What can we replace it with that actually is another non-animal based product? And then do, of course, various testing to actually drill down and find those ideal replacements.
And would you consider maybe licensing or selling your culture to other cell-based meat companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we have thought about. One of the tricks, though, is that all cell lines, so we're working with mouse, nobody else is working with a mouse. All cell lines are pretty specific in terms of what they actually need. So invariably, we can say, okay, here's a base that should be pretty good to get going, but there will absolutely be optimization and tweaking for every cell line. I mean, as is the case, we won't be able to use this exact media with our rabbit cell lines either, but we'll use a similar process to sort of iterate and identify a animal-free media.
Okay, got it. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background story and what basically inspired you to create Because Animals as well?
Sure. So I grew up with 3 dogs and 3 cats. I had a really close relationship with my pets at a young age. I think, I remember viscerally actually preferring to spend my Saturday afternoons hanging out and playing with my cat versus like my friends down the street. And it was just sort of a natural thing for me. And so then as I stopped eating my meat in my early teens for animal welfare reasons, and then started volunteering with shelters and animal rescue organizations in my late teens. And I continued to do that in sort of a more even more time-intensive process. So, I guess, dedicated a lot of time actually when I was working on my PhD. So during the days I would be in the lab, and then in the evenings, a lot of for many years I was the coordinator for the in Toronto, anyhow, where I'm from. The adoption coordinator, and then the feral cat coordinator, and so. A lot of time. And I didn't ever see any opportunity to sort of merge my scientific career with, just this drive and this need that I have this responsibility that I feel. That's ultimately what it is, to help animals. And then I was really fortunate to do my postdoc at Stanford University. And of course, it's this, incredible place in the world. I met Pat Brown, the CEO and founder of Impossible Foods. And it was really at that point that I decided, I'm on the wrong side of the line in terms of being a biomedical researcher. I don't work on any animals in terms of experiments, but invariably, if you're in the biomedical research field, either your research or it's somehow inevitably it's going to be used on an animal at some point. And it was something that was deeply uncomfortable for me. So I decided that was it. I was going to quit my postdoc and dedicate my scientific career to taking animals out of the supply chain. At first, I thought that I would move in the field in the direction of human food, because humans are the main consumers of animal-based products. But as I started to do more research, as we've already discussed, to identify sort of these various points, and then just to think about, okay, well, I haven't eaten meat for decades, but nonetheless, when it comes to my cats, like I'm hamstrung. I mean, I have to support this industry that I otherwise wouldn't. And that's when we decided to work on pet food. And then I met my co-founder, who also happens to be, he also had spent many years in animal rescue, cat rescue in particular, in Toronto. And he had just finished his MBA. And that's when we got started.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, especially with how you helped in those early years of these animal rescue shelters. And something, I watch these videos that come up, and it's like, it's so amazing when these animals get rescued, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're sort of drawn into their story of how bad a shape they were, and then they come out okay, and then they're looking for new owners. But with this lockdown that we've had, and obviously with the pandemic, there's been a lot of people buying pets. And I wonder what's going to happen if there's going to be now more need for these shelters, and there's so much things going wrong with animal breeding as well, especially with dogs. And
no, I mean, my opinion on breeding is, it should not exist. There are certainly, far more homeless animals than there should be. There shouldn't be any. And there's no reason why why breeding should be allowed. And it's also just not good for animals. It's not good for the actual breeded dogs themselves. I mean, pugs in particular, I understand. I mean, they have breathing problems.
They have breathing problems, yeah.
They're bred to, it's really unfair.
Yeah, there's also a lot going around with sausage dogs, having
Ah,
really short
yeah.
legs at the back, and that's pretty cruel, right? To keep breeding them, and they
Yeah,
have difficulties with their
yeah,
spines and
yeah,
everything.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I get it. Have you been back in touch with Pat Brown since you met him, and is he interested in what you're doing? I'm wondering if these, Impossible Beyond Meat, I'm sure they must be interested in this line as well.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you've heard what Pat Brown has to say about cultured meat. He's not
He's
a
not,
big
no.
fan.
Yeah.
Though I don't know what his thoughts are with respect to pet food in particular. But anyhow, I think that a lot of what he says, there's legitimacy. It's going to be very difficult for us to get the price down. That said, obviously, it's not. I don't believe it is impossible. We've seen many examples of how we can actually move this technology forward in a way that will be commercially viable. I do firmly believe that pet food is, for the reasons that we talked about, we can look at lower inclusion levels right out the gate, and with our pets at least ostensibly, or at least being viewed as carnivores, the market for cultured meat is really is pet food, in my opinion.
If you had to put a year on it of where you could basically have a comparable price point for a mass market pet feed, what year would that be, which would be including cell-based cultured meat?
The year would be the first year that we actually launch our cultured meat product, because for us, there's no reason, we have no intention of being a niche product or an elite product. We want to compete directly with those other meat-based pet foods, because our mission is to take animals out of the supply chain. So when we launch our nutritionally complete food, we will be priced competitively with other premium brands. So important to note, though, that within the pet food category, really it is only those premium, ultra premium brands that are continuing, where we see continued growth. That the sort of mid-range, low budget foods for pets is really declining. And so
Why is it declining, by the way?
Well, with the humanization of pet food, so as people, just over the years, have really begun to view their pets more as family members,
Totally, yeah.
as family members, and then even as children. So so people are not satisfied with just giving their pet the lowest quality food. And in fact, we see more similarities in terms of the market. We see more similarities between pet food and baby food than we do between pet food and human food, because humans, like myself, for instance, especially folks that don't have two-legged children but only have four-legged children, we are the caregivers. And so it's where I might risk, trying a food for myself, I'm not going to take any risks when it comes to my pets. So I would prefer, like many people, to make sure that I'm getting the top quality.
Yeah. And I definitely see that analogy with treating the pets like babies. And thinking about the marketing side now, how can you convince potential concerned customers around cell-based that your products are basically going to be healthier and better for them?
Yeah, great question. So this is why we actually launched our company as a consumer brand rather than, say, a B2B company. And we launched specifically with a probiotic-based supplement, one for dogs, one for cats, and a nutritional yeast-based dog cookie. And so we're using these other cultured ingredients, i.e. probiotics and nutritional yeast, that people are already familiar with the health benefits of, to basically say, actually, the way that probiotics and nutritional yeast, the way that they're grown, it's the same process that we use to culture meat. It's just the input, it's a different cell type that goes in originally. Instead of a bacterial cell or a yeast cell, we're putting an animal cell, but the process is the same. So it's not so foreign. It's not so foreign after all. So we're trying to sort of introduce the idea, the concept, and just the practice to folks using these early products. And then, of course, in being able to engage with consumers, asking them questions, and being able to respond and actually create the product that people really want. So we can iterate based on feedback. So that's and then I would just say the other piece is that we're doing our best to really sort of illustrate the differences. So although we are creating meat, and it's not a meat alternative, there are some key differences with our meat versus animal meat in that the way that we grow our meat, of course, because there's no animal involved, which means that there's no animal grown in, frankly speaking, this sort of like this quagmire of its own shit. There's animals, carcasses, all meat has fecal bacteria on it. And this is why people have to cook the meat, because if they don't, they're liable to get sick from salmonella or E. coli. So there are no pathogens on our meat. We don't have to even use antibiotics to grow our meat because we put in an animal cell, no pathogenic bacterial fecal, and grow that meat in a way, of course, in the presence of just nutrients. So cows, pigs, in addition to living in really, really unclean environments, they are also fed antibiotics. And so in fact, in the US, 80% of the antibiotics that are manufactured by pharmaceutical companies are sold to the animal agriculture industry. And prior to COVID, and so now this is, of course, everybody's thinking about COVID, but prior to COVID, really the CDC, the main red alert was antibiotic resistance. And so of course, people would say, maybe it's over prescription by doctors. But if we look at the numbers, 80% of those are sold to animal agriculture. Those animals then ingest the antibiotics, goes through their guts, then they excrete not only antibiotics residues themselves, but also the bacteria that had become resistant to those antibiotics in the gut. And now that feces is then eliminated, and it's basically through the water system is contaminated with bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics, and there you have it.
So then, when you drink that water, then suddenly humans become,
or grow crops, for instance.
Right.
So I mean, that water that's then used to grow vegetables or fruit. And so, when there are fruit and vegetables that are contaminated by E. coli, it's not because they naturally have E. coli on them. It's because the manure that's used to fertilize or the water, this is where the bacteria comes from.
Well, that's a worrying sign, isn't it?
Yeah, it's devastating, actually. And so a lot of folks aren't thinking about it because so the people who are most at risk are people who are immunocompromised, and a huge population are cancer patients. So somebody who's going, for example, say, bone marrow transplant because they have leukemia, they have to have their immune system would be completely ablated. By necessity, you have to do this in order to actually transplant. And what this means now is you have no immune system, you have no natural defenses to fight bacteria. Many of these people end up having a bacterial infection. And if they happen to be unlucky enough to actually have an infection that is resistant to all antibiotics, they die. And so, I think people tend to think, this person died of cancer. They didn't die of cancer. They died of a bacterial infection because of cancer. They shouldn't have died of a bacterial infection. And so the situation's becoming increasingly grim, but it's really not on people's radar.
What do you think about the correlation between, I don't think there's that much research, but in terms of animals getting cancer, potentially from their diet?
Well, I mean, I certainly think if you speak with different veterinarians, as you said, I don't think there's been a tremendous amount of research that's been done, but anecdotally, many veterinarians that I've spoken with, who have been practicing for, say, decades, just over the past 10 years even, they've seen an increase. And so whether that's food, increase in the incidence of cancer. And so whether that's food, whether it's something that's airborne, it's not clear, but food seems like, the most likely thing to look at first.
Yeah. So can you tell me about your investment, how much you've raised so far, and who your main investors are?
Yeah. So to date, we've raised a total of 6.7 million in investment, and we're coming up to our Series A early next year. So that will be exciting time for us. Our first investors, institutional investors, was SOSV, whom we think are just the bee's knees. We also have investment from Draper Associates, another phenomenal investor on our cap table, and most recently with our seed round, that was led by a company called Orkla, which is a very, very large European food conglomerate based out of Norway.
Nice. And what would you say is your long-term vision now of the company?
Yes, long term, I would love to see, because animals, replace every animal-based meat food that exists. That seems very pie in the sky, but that's my long-term vision. To get there, though, in both the near term, medium term, and long term, we will really internally be very, very focused on constantly trying to bring our costs down internally, as well as scaling. So, to basically be able to grow more and more of these cells at a commercially viable price point.
Yeah. So, just to finish off with, I'm of Indian heritage, even though I was born in London. I heard you studied Indian ideology and the Northern Indian dance, traditional dance of Kathak.
Yes, yeah.
What led you to do that? And do you still practice that dance today?
Yeah, actually, so I'm curious. I'd love to know how you actually found that out, because you're the first person who's ever asked me that, and I don't really broadcast it. So I'd love to know how you.
I actually heard a podcast that you did. It was a veterinary innovation podcast with some people that you know. So I think one of the person who interviewed you knows you personally. Is that right? And they may have mentioned it on that show.
Perhaps. I don't recall, but I guess so. Yeah, I'll take your word for
it. Yeah, but it's fantastic that you learned that.
Yeah, but yes. So I started studying Kathak when I was, maybe probably close to 20 years ago, I think. And yeah, I have to say, I mean, as a kid, I was always just really mesmerized by classical Indian music and dance. And then as I got older and started to explore more, definitely the north form, because of course north, south, east, west, all very different, but it was the north that really stood out to me. And I was lucky enough, living in Toronto, I found an incredible teacher, and her name is Joanna D'Souza, and she studied with quite a renowned Kathak dancer. And the cool thing about Joanna is that she's also this, white woman from sort of a little rural part just outside of Toronto, who lived in Kolkata and for many years and is a top-notch dancer. And so, yeah, I studied with her for many years and was able to. It was an incredible time, because the dance studio, or the dance company, was also coupled with a tabla ensemble. So our practices, our performances would be often, with live musicians and drummers. It was really quite magical. And then I moved to California, and then to do my postdoc, and of course, so I was not studying with Joanna anymore, and I sort of have. I really, frankly, actually haven't danced. I mean, aside from sort of, the odd little jingle in my kitchen or something like that, but I haven't danced for years. But I was speaking with Joanna, good timing, just recently, and due to COVID, she spent the year basically building up her virtual classes, and so I just actually started again last weekend. So just joining her virtually for classes. So yeah, it's a love of mine.
That's awesome. Yeah. I actually play the drums. So I actually, many years ago, learned the tabla.
Oh,
I've
cool.
forgotten it all now because I'm more into the traditional form of Western drumming. So I'm actually in a band.
Ah, okay.
We're kind of a rock band that was formed during COVID-19 called
Cool.
Corkfield 19, which is basically the dads on my street all got together.
Great.
Yeah, if you want to see it, it's we're on Facebook team, so you can take a look.
Cool.
But yeah, so that's great to have that passion. And did you learn Sanskrit as well?
I didn't. No, no, I didn't. Yeah, it's languages are an Achilles heel of mine.
Yeah, it obviously doesn't get used very much, but is the oldest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Great to get you on the show. Really pleased with the direction that you're going. Obviously, this is super important. Pets are like our family and, like you say, like our babies, and people are concerned with what they're eating. And the current way of doing it really needs to be reset with all the environmental issues and the stuff to do with animal welfare. So yeah, congratulations on your raise. Really looking forward to see how you progress.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat with you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much and speak to you soon.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Annette. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.